I want to tell you something first, before we get into any of this. I've been in 37 star systems. I've seen things that would make a core world colonist faint on the spot. Creatures with 17 limbs that communicate through color shifts in their skin, gas giants with living things inside the storms, moons where the gravity works sideways, and you learn real quick to trust your magnetics over your gut. I've seen enough that I thought I was past being surprised. I was wrong. What happened on Station Vorath 9 in the late season of the Galactic Standard Year 4882, I still think about it at least 3 times a week. And I've been doing this work for 19 years. You don't stay surprised for 19 years in deep corridor transit unless something genuinely got to you. This one got to me. Let me start where I should start, with the station itself, because Vorath 9 isn't a place that gets explained easily. You have to feel it before you can understand what happened there. Vorath 9 sits at the edge of what transit guides call the Neutral Corridor 7, a stretch of space about 42 light-years long that doesn't technically belong to any recognized galactic government. Not the Vorath Collective, not the Human Compact, not the Usan Hegemony. Nobody. It's old territory, older than most current civilization's expansion records, and the station itself was built during an era that nobody alive remembers personally. The walls of Vorath 9 are made from a compressed mineral called thurite black, a deep, almost wet-looking dark stone that absorbs about 90% of visible light. When you come in from the transit dock, the first thing you feel is the sound disappearing. Not because it's silent, because the walls eat it. Your footsteps go in and don't quite come back. Your voice travels about 2 meters and then softens like it's being wrapped in cloth. It's not claustrophobic, exactly. The ceilings are 30 meters high, but it's intimate in the way that a very old building is intimate, like the place has opinions about noise. The air recyclers on Vorath 9 are old-generation Usan units, probably 150 years old, based on the housing design. They work perfectly, but they work with a particular rhythm. Every 43 seconds they exhale. Not loudly, just this soft, slow breath that moves through the ventilation grid and displaces the standing air in a way that you feel on the back of your neck before you hear it. After an hour on the station, you start to breathe with it. Everybody does. I've never met a person who walked that station for more than an hour and didn't unconsciously sink to it. The commerce floor is the heart of the place. 3 levels of trading stalls, repair shops, transit information kiosks, and a dozen or so food vendors serving whatever they'd managed to stock from their last supply run. The stall frames are wrought from the same thurite black as the walls, but the vendors hang colored fabric and light strips to give their spaces identity. So you get this effect, a vast dark cavern, broken up by pools of amber light, blue-white glow strips, warm orange fabric from the Yessin textile merchants, the occasional holo display cycling through transit data or goods listings. It smells like mineral oil, cooked protein of various biological origins, and something faintly electric, like the air right before lightning, but constant. That's the recyclers again, something about their ion output. You stop noticing it after 20 minutes, but it never actually goes away. The people, and I use that word in its broadest galactic sense, on Vorath 9 are mostly transient. It's a way station, a stopping point. You're there because you need fuel or supplies, or because your transit coordinates require a calculation update, or because someone on board your vessel needs medical attention that your ship's kit can't handle. You're not there because you chose it as a destination. Nobody chooses Vorath 9 as a destination. Which means the population at any given time is a cross-section of whoever happens to be passing through the neutral corridor. Usan merchants with their jointed extra arms folded politely against their torsos, their compound eyes tracking prices across multiple stalls simultaneously. Human haulers from the outer compact settlements, thick-set and practical, usually looking for the quickest path between their ship and a hot meal. Vorath collective citizens, tall, pale, with the faintly bioluminescent tracery under their skin that marks their species, moving through the station with the particular calm of people who consider this corridor their ancestral territory, even if they don't technically govern it anymore. Occasionally something rarer, a Dorath diplomat in transit, or a Scar trader with their unsettling habit of going completely motionless between sentences. And sometimes humans. Not the haulers, not the compact settlers, the other kind. The kind who come out of the deep-old territories with no transit ID that anyone can immediately verify, no registered vessel class, and a look in their eyes like they've been somewhere the standard charts don't cover. That's what Marshal Yeva Kress was looking for when she found him. I should tell you about Marshal Kress. I should tell you because if I don't, you'll picture something she wasn't, and the story won't make sense. Yeva Kress was a Loren, a species from the Usan Outer Rings, one of the smaller civilizations that had aligned with the Usan hegemony about 3 centuries ago without being fully absorbed. She stood about 2.3 meters tall, which is on the shorter end for Loren females. Her frame was angular, sharp shoulders, long forearms, fingers that had an extra articulation point between the second and third knuckle that let them close in ways that human hands can't. Her coloring was the deep blue-gray of Loren males in colder climates, though she was female. The color distinction in her species runs on a different axis than most humanoid patterns, and it's complicated enough that I'm not going to get into it here. Her eyes were the thing you noticed first, if you were paying attention. Loren eyes are large and positioned slightly wider on the skull than human eyes, which gives them a peripheral range that's nearly double what a human can see without turning their head. The iris color was a pale amber, almost gold, and it caught light differently than human eyes do, more reflective. When she turned her head toward you in a dim space, you saw the light move in her eyes before you fully registered that she'd looked at you. She was a transit marshal, one of the independent enforcement officers that the Neutral Corridor Authority contracts to maintain order in stations like Vorath 9. The NCA is a thin organization. It has no fleet to speak of, no military authority, and about 12 permanent staff for the entire corridor. What it does have is a roster of contracted marshals, individuals with verified law enforcement credentials from their home jurisdictions, who rotate through the corridor stations on assignment cycles. Kress had been on Vorath 9 for 8 standard weeks at the point this happened. Her job was what transit marshal jobs always are: check manifests, resolve disputes, handle the occasional drunken confrontation between species who shouldn't be sharing the same airlock, and flag anything that looked like it didn't fit. She was good at the last part especially. She had a reputation not widely known because neutral corridor enforcement isn't the kind of work that builds wide reputations, but known among the people who move through these stations regularly. The reputation was simply this: Kress noticed things. She had the particular talent of watching a crowd and identifying the element that was wrong. Not criminal necessarily, not dangerous, just wrong, the thing that didn't fit the pattern. She was good enough at it that she'd caught 3 different freight fraud operations, 2 identity forgery rings, and 1 attempted compact treaty violation in her 8 weeks on Vorath 9 alone. The NCA rotation was supposed to be 12 weeks. At the rate she was going, she'd have cleared more cases in a single rotation than most marshals managed in a year. She was also, and this is relevant, deeply unfamiliar with humans. Not hostile, not prejudiced as far as I could tell, just unfamiliar. The Loren home systems don't border human compact space, and her previous enforcement postings had been in Usan territory where human transients were uncommon. She'd processed maybe 30 human individuals in her entire professional career before Vorath 9. She knew the basic parameters: bipedal, mammalian, roughly her height or shorter, notable for a physiological resilience that was considered moderate by galactic standards, coming from a relatively new spacefaring civilization that had expanded aggressively in the last 4 centuries. What she didn't know was the texture of humans, the way they move, the things they do when they're uncomfortable, the particular quality of human stillness when a human is waiting for something. She was about to learn. I was at a food vendor stall on the middle commerce level when it started. My name is Pel Doran. I'm a transit data broker, which means I buy and sell route information, cargo timing data, and transit schedule intelligence. It's a legal business mostly, and it keeps me moving through stations like Vorath 9 on a regular basis, which means I see a lot. I was eating something the vendor called a grain compress. It was nutritionally adequate and tasted like warm cardboard, which I'd come to accept as the Vorath 9 culinary experience, when I heard the commotion start. Not loud, not initially. Just a ripple in the crowd sound, that particular shift when people stopped their own conversations and turned toward something. I turned. Down on the lower commerce level, near the main transit information kiosk, was the human. He'd been there when I arrived, maybe 40 minutes earlier. I'd clocked him the way you clock unusual things on a station, registered him, filed him in the back of my mind, moved on. He was sitting on one of the low partition walls that divided the commerce floor, gray composite material, maybe half a meter high, with his back against a support column and his legs stretched out in front of him. He was human. Male, I thought, though I'm always cautious about that assumption with species I'm not expert on. Medium height, maybe 1.80 m. His clothing was unusual, not in cut, which was standard outer rim practical, but in condition and material. Worn in a way that suggested long, sustained use rather than recent damage. The kind of worn-in that takes years of actual wear, not the artificial distressing some traders affect to look like they've been places. His boots especially, the kind of deep, worked-in degradation at the toe, and heel that you can't fake because it comes from specific friction patterns that are unique to individual gait. His hands were resting on his knees, still, not fidgeting, not moving, just resting. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. His eyes were open, and they moved occasionally, tracking movement in the commerce floor, but without urgency or focus. Like a person sitting in a place they know well, watching familiar things happen. That was the first thing that was strange. Because Vorath 9 is not a place where anyone sits like they know it well. It's a way station. People move with purpose here because their purpose is always transit. Get the thing, do the thing, get back to the ship. Nobody sits with that particular quality of comfortable stillness in a way station. Nobody except people who have been there a very, very long time. And he hadn't been there a very, very long time. I'd been on Vorath 9 for 6 days on this rotation, and I hadn't seen him until about 40 minutes ago. I noticed those things, the stillness, the quality of it, and then I let it go, because I had my own business to attend to, and noticing unusual things in way stations is an occupational habit, not an obligation. But Marshal Kress had noticed him too. She came down the access ramp from the upper commerce level with the particular walk that enforcement officers develop, not aggressive, not hurrying, but with a direction to it that makes everyone in the path unconsciously step aside. Not because she was threatening, because she was clearly going somewhere specific, and that specificity in a way station crowd reads as authority even before anyone sees the badge. She stopped about 3 meters from the human. He didn't look up immediately. That too was unusual. Most beings, regardless of species, register the approach of a tall, official-looking individual with environmental sensors as sharp as Kress's. It's biological. You feel when something that might be significant is moving toward you. You look. He looked up when she was about 2 meters away, not startled, just acknowledging, the way you look up when you've been aware someone was coming for a while and you're confirming what you already knew. She said something in standard galactic common, the trade language that about 2/3 of registered spacefaring species use as a functional bridge. I was too far to hear the exact words, but I knew the cadence. Show me your transit documentation. Standard opening for a transit check, routine. He reached into the interior pocket of his outer layer, no hesitation, no visible concern, and produced a card. A physical card. Not a biochip reader, not a projectable holographic ID matrix, not an embedded credential scanner device. A physical card. Kress took it, looked at it, held it at arm's length, which was a Lauren gesture of closer visual examination. Their near focus is actually weaker than their mid-range, so they pull things slightly away when they want to see fine detail. She rotated it once. Then she ran it through the handheld scanner on her belt. I watched her read the output on the scanner screen. Her posture changed. Subtle. If you weren't watching for it, and most people weren't, they'd gone back to their own business after the initial ripple of attention, you'd have missed it. But I was still watching, because something about the whole scene had a quality that my 19 years of way station experience was flagging as interesting. Her posture changed the way it changes when the scanner says something that doesn't match what you're looking at. A fraction of a degree of lean. The head tilting to see the screen from a different angle, like maybe the angle was the problem. She looked at the card again. She looked at him. She looked at the scanner. Then she said something. I still couldn't hear the words, but the cadence was different now. Not the routine transit check cadence. The other cadence. The one that means there's a problem here. He responded. I couldn't hear that either, but whatever he said, it was brief. She said something else. He responded again. And then she did something that made the whole commerce floor go quiet again. She reached to her equipment belt and drew the combat knife. I want to be careful how I describe the knife, because I don't want you to misunderstand what it was. Law enforcement officers are authorized to carry what the NCA calls close-range deterrent tools, which is the bureaucratic category that covers everything from shock implements to monofilament restraints to edged weapons. The knife that Kress carried was standard law enforcement issue, a 30-centimeter blade of a ceramic halide composite, matte finished, with a slight forward curve in the last 8 centimeters that made it effective for restraint leverage rather than pure cutting. It wasn't a weapon designed to kill. It was designed to control, to be something that a person of most species would look at and decide to stop moving. She didn't draw it to attack him. She drew it because she was standing in front of a being whose transit documentation said things that made no sense, and whatever he had said in response had been insufficient, and the standard escalation protocol when verbal exchange doesn't resolve a documentation discrepancy is to shift to physical deterrent presence. She held it out in the low ready position, blade angled toward him, not raised, just visible and present. A law enforcement gesture that means stop what you're doing and comply. The commerce floor, which had been gradually returning to its ambient noise level, went quiet again. Not completely. The recyclers still breathed. Some vendors were still conducting transactions at the back of their stalls, but the active human sound dropped. He looked at the knife. I was watching his face. His face did something I've never seen a face do in response to a drawn blade in a tense situation. It went interested. Not afraid, not compliant, not the angry aggressive response of someone who's being challenged and doesn't like it. Not even the particular careful calm of a person who's trained to handle confrontation without panic. Interested, the way you look when you see something that reminds you of something else, or when you recognize an object you haven't seen in a long time. He leaned forward slightly, just an inch or two, and looked at the knife with what I can only describe as appreciation. And then he reached out slowly with his right hand. Toward the blade. Kress moved back half a step, fast, reactive, which was not the standard enforcement response. The standard enforcement response to a suspect reaching toward your weapon is forward pressure and a verbal command. You don't step back. Stepping back cedes physical control of the engagement zone. She stepped back, and then she froze, because his hand, still moving slowly, reached the midpoint between them, the point where, if she hadn't stepped back, his fingers would have been about 10 centimeters from the blade. And the light changed around his hand. This is the part that's hard to explain. I've tried to explain this about 15 times since it happened, to 15 different people, and every time I feel like I'm failing, because what happened wasn't dramatic exactly. There was no flash, no noise, no sudden impact. It was quiet. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing that, if you weren't already looking directly at it, you might have explained away as a trick of the lighting. The light around his hand went inconsistent. Not shadow, not brighter. Inconsistent. Like the light that was hitting his hand was simultaneously doing two different things. Some of it going through, the way light goes through glass, and some of it reflecting, the way light reflects off a solid surface. For about 3 seconds, his hand was both there and not there in a way that I don't have precise language for. The woman at the food stall 2 meters from me made a sound, not a word, just a short, involuntary syllable that I recognized as a ussin expression of perceptual alarm. The man beside her, a Vorath merchant, went completely still in the way Vorath go still when they're startled and choosing not to move. Kress stood absolutely frozen, her enforcement knife still held in a grip that had gone stiff rather than fluid. The human lowered his hand, looked up at her, said something. This time I was close enough. The floor was quiet enough that I heard it. He said, in standard galactic common, in a voice that was conversational and unhurried, "That's a Phase 3 Lauren enforcement blade. Last time I saw one of those, they were still being field tested. That was before this station was built." Part 2, what the scanner said. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Marshal Kress did something that I have to respect in retrospect. She didn't run. She didn't call for backup. She didn't do the thing that a lot of beings might do when their basic physical understanding of reality gets poked with a stick, which is to start making noise and hope someone else deals with it. She said, "What are you?" Not hostile, not aggressive. The way you say what are you when you genuinely need to know the answer and everything you thought you knew has just turned out to be potentially wrong. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down, this will take a while." She didn't sit, but she also didn't maintain the blade in ready position. She slid it back into its housing, a deliberate, considered motion, not a surrendering one, and she took one step back and folded her arms. Which I learned later is actually a signal in Lauren body language. It means I'm listening, and I'm making no commitment about what comes next. He watched her do it, and then he said, "Close enough." I stayed where I was. I had good reason to. I wasn't in anyone's way. I wasn't making a spectacle of myself. And what was happening in front of me was the most interesting thing I'd witnessed in about 4 years of waystation work. My grain compress was long since cold. I'd forgotten I was holding it. He started talking. I'll tell you what he said, and then I'll tell you what it meant, and then I'll tell you what happened when it was verified. His name was Calloway. He didn't offer a first name, just Calloway, and when Cress asked for clarification on the full registered name, he said simply that the registered name system she was using hadn't existed when he was registered, and she'd need to work backward through the archival layers to find it. He was human. That part was straightforward. Human male, born in what was now designated as the pre-compact expansion era, which, for reference, is the period before the human compact was formally constituted as a recognized galactic political entity. That period ended approximately 240 years ago. He had been a navigator on an early survey vessel, the kind of mission that the early human expansion sent out into the neutral corridor before the corridor was the neutral corridor, before there were transit marshals or NCA oversight or standardized documentation. The kind of mission that went out with the understanding that it might not come back, because the maps at the time were preliminary and space is large and unforgiving. The mission had encountered what the early human survey records classified as a deep field anomaly, a term that covered, in the era before modern astrophysics formalized the relevant categories, anything from unexpected gravitational events to what is now understood as Class 4 temporal distortion. His ship had gone through it. Only he had come out the other side. Not immediately, not cleanly. His words were, "Imagine being translated. You know what translation is. Between languages, something goes in one form and it comes out in another form, and somewhere in between it's neither." Cress stared at him. He said, "That's what happened. I went in, I came out, in between I was neither." He had been in transit, in whatever state existed between the in and the out, for approximately 227 years in external time. In his subjective experience, he said, it had been different. Time didn't move cleanly in a Class 4 distortion. Subjectively, it was like being in a room where the walls kept changing what they were made of. Sometimes he was aware of time passing. Sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes he had a body. Sometimes he wasn't sure. "When I came out," he said, "I was here in this corridor, and I was less solid than I'm used to being." He said it with the tone of someone describing a minor inconvenience, a persistent leak in a water recycler, a navigation system that needs recalibration. This is the point where Cress started asking harder questions. She was smart, which I'd expected from what I knew of her reputation, and she'd done what smart enforcement officers do when they're presented with an extraordinary explanation for an extraordinary phenomenon. She'd taken the explanation seriously enough to start stress testing it rather than dismissing it. She asked about the transit documentation first. He explained, the transit documentation system in use on Vorath 9, the one her scanner was connected to, ran on the Galactic Registry Network. The GRN was established 184 years ago as a unified record system for all species operating in the recognized galactic corridor zones. Any individual documented in the GRN can be scanned and verified. His documentation was older than the GRN. "Your scanner," he said, "is looking for a file that exists in an archival layer that the active network doesn't routinely access. It found a reference. That's why the output was strange. It returned a partial match to a pre-registry record with a flag indicating the file is in closed archival storage." Cress turned the scanner display toward him. "This says you've been flagged as deceased. Death recorded 223 years ago. Cause listed as Deep Field Survey lost contact. No body recovered." He nodded, "That sounds right." "That is not right," she said. "You are standing in front of me." "I know," he said. "That's the inconvenient part. I want to pause here and tell you something about the science, because if you don't have the context, the rest of this doesn't make full sense. Class 4 temporal distortions are a real, documented phenomenon. They're rare. There are only 11 confirmed instances in the accessible survey record, but they're real, and the physics of them, while not fully understood, is established enough that there's an academic field dedicated to the study. What happens in simplified terms is this. A Class 4 distortion is a region of space where the relationship between matter, energy, and time, which is normally a stable, predictable triangle of mutual dependency, gets disrupted at the foundational level. The mechanism is not fully agreed upon, but the leading model involves what theoretical physicists call existence quantization. The idea that in extreme enough conditions, the state of being something rather than not being something becomes probabilistic rather than fixed. In a Class 4 distortion, you don't stop existing, but you stop existing consistently. The survival rate for known Class 4 encounters is approximately 4%. Of those who survive, roughly half emerge with no documented changes, though later studies suggest some percentage of these individuals have subtle changes that simply weren't detected with the technology of their era. The other half emerge changed. Most of these changes are biological, cellular restructuring, altered neurological patterns, modifications to the organic chemistry at the quantum level. Most of these changes are fatal within months, as the altered biology tries to interact with normal space and simply cannot. But there's a category, a small, poorly documented category, where the emergence creates something that isn't quite standard-state biological existence. The archival literature calls it deep field coherence stabilization, a condition where the individual's matter state becomes semi-fixed at a probability close to, but not equal to, 100%. In plain language, they're mostly solid, mostly present, mostly real in the conventional sense. But the mostly is what matters, because there are conditions, primarily related to photonic interaction at certain frequencies, where the mostly drops enough to be visible. The light passing through his hand. That was the mostly, the small, constant, persistent gap between what he was and what full material existence looks like. Marshal Kress didn't know any of this when she first saw it. But she was about to find out, because she was the kind of person who, when reality stops cooperating with her expectations, goes looking for better information rather than insisting on her expectations. She made a call. I watched her step away from him, keeping him in her sight line, which was professional, and open a channel on her communication unit. From the formality of her posture and the length of the call, I guessed she was talking to someone with technical expertise. The Vorath 9 station manager, maybe, or a relay to NCA Central. He waited. He waited the way he'd been sitting when I first arrived, with that quality of comfortable stillness that I'd noticed and hadn't been able to account for. Now, watching him with the context of what he'd said, I understood it differently. When you've been in a state of probabilistic existence for 227 years, the passage of a few minutes while someone makes a communication call is nothing. Waiting is the smallest possible thing. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't scanning the exits, which is the thing that people who are building a false story do, because they're always checking whether their escape route is still clear. He was just there, present in a way that was, paradoxically, more real feeling than most solid beings I've observed. The call lasted about 12 minutes. When Kress came back, her posture had changed again. Less the enforcement officer posture, the solid, angled stance that says I am in control of this situation. More something else, less decided. She said, the technical liaison says there's a documented class of deep field emergence that matches what you're describing, and the archival record your documentation traces back to, the GRN has a flag on it. It's a pre-network closed file from the early survey era. The file contains a vessel record for a survey ship called the Havernath's Path, lost with all hands in the neutral corridor 223 years ago. He said, was her name Yenna, the survey log officer. Kress checked her display, read something, looked up. She said yes. He nodded, said nothing. Just nodded and looked somewhere else briefly, Not at anything in the commerce floor, somewhere internal, and then came back. Good, he said. She was meticulous. I was hoping the record survived. I learned later, from someone who talked to Crest directly in the period after this, that the archival file for the Havernath's Path had been in closed storage for 2 centuries. It was one of about 800 early survey vessel records that the Galactic Registry Network had inherited when it absorbed the older documentation systems. Most of these files were simply lost ships, dead ends, records of things that had gone out and not come back and been mourned and archived. The Havernath's Path file had one additional notation that the others didn't. Added approximately 40 years after the vessel was listed as lost, by a Vorath collective cartographic officer who had been documenting anomalies in the neutral corridor. Anomalous readings in Grid 7 Epsilon consistent with Class 4 temporal distortion event. Scale and duration suggest possibility of partial survival. No recovery mission authorized. File maintained for reference. 40 years after the ship was lost, someone had noted that something might have survived, and then filed it away. And nobody had looked at it since. Until Cress's scanner hit the reference while trying to verify a transit document on a figure, sitting quietly on a partition wall in a waystation commerce floor. Part 3, the weight of being mostly real. Here's something I want you to understand about what the next part of this looked like, because I think it matters. It didn't look dramatic. There was no moment of cinematic revelation with light and music. The commerce floor of Vorath 9 didn't go completely silent and stay that way. People had already gone back to their business. Merchants selling, haulers eating, the rhythm of a waystation doing what waystations do. And by the time the most significant part of the conversation was happening, most of the crowd had moved on to their own concerns. What was left was 2 people in a pool of amber light from a textile vendor's strip lamps, in a corner of a dark-walled station that breathed every 43 seconds, talking. One was a Lauren enforcement officer who had 20 minutes ago drawn a knife at what she'd thought was an unverified, suspicious transit case, and was now sitting across from him on the partition wall because she'd been standing long enough, and the situation had shifted into something that standing-up posture didn't fit anymore. One was a 223-year-old human navigator who was mostly solid. I was still there. I had moved to a different position, slightly closer, ostensibly because the food vendor I'd been sitting near had closed up for a rest period. In truth, I moved closer because I wanted to hear, and the acoustics near the support column were better. I'm not ashamed of this. Information brokerage is what I do, and what I was witnessing was the most remarkable piece of information I'd encountered in my career. Cress asked practical questions first. That was her nature, systematic, ground-level practical before abstract. How did he eat? Did he need to eat? He said, yes, less than a standard human requires. The gap, let's call it the gap, changes the metabolic baseline somewhat. I eat about 1/3 of standard human caloric intake. Regular food, nothing unusual. My digestive biology still functions. How did he sleep? Intermittently, 4 to 6 hours in every 36. Deep sleep doesn't work the same way for me. There's a transitional state that isn't quite rest and isn't quite consciousness. Feels like the distortion, actually. I've gotten used to it. She asked, does it hurt, the gap? He thought about this one. Actually paused to think, rather than having the answer ready, which told me it was a real question rather than one he'd answered 100 times. No, he said finally. It doesn't hurt. It's like having a word on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite produce. You know what full, solid existence feels like, theoretically. You remember it, but there's this constant slight reaching toward it that doesn't quite complete. It doesn't hurt, but it's there. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, that sounds lonely. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read, not quite surprise, not quite recognition. Something between. It's not the word I'd use, he said. What word would you use? He was quiet for a long moment. Unfinished, he said. She asked what he'd been doing for the last 223 years. He said moving. He explained, after emerging from the distortion into recognizable space, a process that itself took time he couldn't measure accurately. He'd spent the first several years simply trying to understand what he was. What his state was, whether it was stable, whether it would worsen or improve, whether there were others. There weren't others. As far as he'd been able to determine across 2 centuries of searching, he was the only documented case of his particular variety of deep-field survival. He'd contacted, or tried to contact, human authorities early on. This was in the period when the Human Compact was still newly constituted, still finding its structure and its governance. The reception had been complicated. There were officials who wanted to study him. There were officials who wanted to classify him as a security concern. There were officials who responded to the particular quality of his incomplete material existence with varying degrees of religious or philosophical alarm. None of it had been productive. He'd moved on. For 2 centuries, he'd moved through the corridor, the neutral space, the interstitial territory. Not the compact, not the hegemony, not the collective. The between spaces. Way stations like Vorath 9 were familiar ground. Places where nobody expected documentation to be simple, where the unusual was routine enough to pass without crisis, where a man who was mostly solid could sit quietly on a partition wall and be largely left alone. Kress said, "You've been on this station before." "Dozens of times," he said. "I watched them build the secondary commerce level, saw at least 3 station managers come and go. The thurite walls were repaired in the outer ring about 60 years ago. They used different composite mix for the patching, so if you look at the wall behind the transit kiosk in the right light, you can see the seam." Kress turned and looked at the wall, then looked back. "The seam is there," she said, with the tone of someone confirming something they wouldn't have thought to check. "I know," he said. She asked him why he was still here. In the corridor, in the stations, 2 centuries of movement, wasn't there a goal, a destination, something he was trying to reach? He said, "I'm a navigator. Navigation without destination is what I do now." "That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I have." She was quiet for a while, then, "You're waiting for something." Not a question, an observation. He looked at her with those eyes, human eyes, which are unremarkable by galactic standards, medium-set, standard color range, but with an expression behind them that had more weight than eyes usually carry. "You're good," he said. "Yes, I'm waiting." "For what?" "For whatever comes next," he said. "Whatever was interrupted when I went into the distortion and didn't quite come out the same way I went in, I've always had the sense that it's not finished. That something is still in motion. I don't know what. I haven't found the word for it yet." "Unfinished," Kress said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that one. Part 4, the second strange thing. I need to tell you about what happened 2 hours later, because this is where the story stops being about one extraordinary thing and becomes about what happens when 2 extraordinary things find each other. 2 hours after the conversation I've described, the station alarm went active. Not the full emergency alarm, not the deep cycling tone that means hull breach or fire or catastrophic system failure. The security level alarm, a shorter, sharper pulse, repeated at 5-second intervals. It came from the lower cargo transit corridor, which connects the commerce floor to the docking arms. What had happened? A freight vessel had arrived through the transit dock. Standard procedure: arrival, manifest check, docking arm assignment, cargo offload. But the manifest the vessel had filed before docking didn't match what was actually on board. Specifically, the vessel was carrying 3 undocumented individuals in a sealed cargo container, an illegal transit arrangement that the Neutral Corridor Authority classified as a serious violation, because sealed container transit is how you move people who can't or won't use registered passage. The 3 individuals, when station security opened the container, turned out to be Vorath collective citizens trying to move through the corridor without papers. Not criminals, not dangerous, just people in the middle of a situation that had made legal passage impossible, who had paid someone with a freight ship more money than they could afford to move them anonymously. The freight captain, when confronted, had panicked. He'd shoved past the security officer who opened the cargo hold, a young Ussan male who was new to the posting and hadn't braced properly, and he'd run. Into the commerce floor. He came up the access ramp at a run and into the commerce floor crowd, and he was big, broad through the shoulders, with the particular heavy gait of someone who'd spent their life in high-gravity work environments. And people scattered from him the way people scatter from sudden high-momentum impacts in tight spaces, fast and without coordination. Marshal Kress had heard the alarm and was already moving. I'd seen her stand and start toward the cargo corridor before I'd registered what the alarm was for, which is the response time of someone who keeps the threat map of their station environment constantly updated in the back of their mind. She was moving toward the ramp when the freight captain came up it. They missed each other by about a meter. She went right, he went left, and suddenly he was in the middle of the commerce floor with the alarm pulsing and Cress realigning, and the crowd trying to figure out which direction was safe. He was going to reach the outer corridor. I could see it. The path was clear enough, and he was moving with enough speed that the crowd opening in front of him would get him to the outer corridor access before Cress could close the distance. And then Calloway was in front of him. I don't know where he came from. That's the honest truth of it. One moment he was still sitting on the partition wall, or so I'd thought. I'd looked away for 2 seconds, maybe 3, while processing the alarm direction. And then he was standing in the middle of the commerce floor, 4 meters from where he'd been, directly in the freight captain's path. The captain didn't stop. He was moving too fast to stop, and his read of the figure in front of him was probably person who hasn't gotten out of my way yet. He ran directly into Calloway. Or tried to. The impact, and there was an impact. There was a sound, a brief concussion of displaced air and the thump of mass meeting mass, lasted about a quarter of a second. And then the freight captain was on the floor, on his hands and knees, with the expression of a person who had run into something that was and wasn't there simultaneously, and couldn't reconcile either part of that with anything their body knew how to process. Calloway was still standing. Not moved, not displaced, just standing there looking down at the freight captain on the floor with the same expression he'd had when he looked at Cress's knife. Interested, calm, completely present in a way that had nothing to do with how solid he was or wasn't. Cress was there in 4 seconds, restraint cuffs on the freight captain before he'd gotten his hands and knees sorted out. The security officer from the cargo corridor came up the ramp 30 seconds later. Standard apprehension, clean and fast. Calloway stepped back out of the way and watched. When Cress looked at him, after the captain was secured and the immediate situation resolved, she just held eye contact for a moment. He said nothing. She said nothing. Then she went back to her work. I talked to Cress that evening, in the transit marshal's office on the upper station level. She agreed to talk to me, not as a source for anything official, which I respected, but she was willing to describe her experience, which is something different. She said, when I drew the knife, I drew it because the documentation situation was irregular, and he wasn't responding to verbal directives with the expected compliance pattern. My read was potential hostility. I asked what happened to that read when she saw what happened with his hand and the light. She said, it didn't disappear. A threat read doesn't disappear because something unusual happens. If anything, unusual things in an enforcement situation increase the threat read because you've lost the predictive model. She paused. Then, but there's a category distinction between threatening unusual and just unusual. The threatening unusual type generates a certain kind of response in the body. I can describe it clinically. It's adrenal cascade triggering rapid posture shift toward cover. What happened when I saw his hand, that was the other kind. Not threatening, just outside the model entirely. I asked what the distinction felt like. She thought for a moment, and then she said something I've been turning over since. Fear goes to the body first. All goes to the eyes first. With the threatening unusual, I felt it in my legs before I understood it. With him, I understood it in my eyes before I felt anything else. I said, that's a useful distinction. She said, I've had 20 years to develop useful distinctions. I asked what she was going to do, about the documentation situation, about him, technically speaking, being listed as deceased in the GRN. She said, I filed an anomalous encounter report with the NCA, flagging the archival cross-reference. The formal position is that a pre-GRN closed file that resolves to a living individual requires reactivation review. There's a process for that. It's designed for cases where someone was wrongly declared lost. It wasn't designed for this specific situation, but the process works the same way. And in the meantime, she said, he has provisional transit clearance. The documentation holds as archival verified, which is a legal status. He's not illegal, he's just complicated. She said that last word with something that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent to it. I asked, what do you think he is at the end of all this? Cress folded her hands on the desk. That deliberate, composed way Lauren do when they're choosing their words carefully, like they're settling weight before lifting something. She said, he's a man who went somewhere and didn't quite come back, but he's still going somewhere. I think that matters more than the category. Part 5, the full weight of the record. I'm going to tell you the last part now. The part that I keep coming back to. Not the light through his hand, that was remarkable, yes, extraordinary in the literal sense of the word. Not the freight captain bouncing off a man who was mostly not there, that was dramatic and strange. Not even the conversation about being unfinished, which I've already told you is what stays with me when I'm between jobs on a long transit, and the stars are just points of light outside the observation port. The last part happened the following morning. I was in the transit information corridor, the narrow passage between the commerce floor and the docking arm access, filing a route data update. It was early by station time before the commerce floor opened fully and the corridor was quiet. Just the recyclers breathing, just the thurite walls absorbing sound. He was there, standing at the far end of the corridor, near the viewport that looks out onto the docking arm exterior. Just standing, looking out at the ships, the various vessels clipped to the station's docking system, lit from below by the station's exterior lighting, above by whatever stars were visible from this position in the corridor. I didn't announce myself. I continued with what I was doing, working on the data unit, conscious of him at the edge of my awareness. After a few minutes without turning, he said, Peldoran, transit data broker, you've been on this station 6 days. I stopped working. How do you know my name? I said. I looked at your registration card when you came through the commerce floor on the first day, he said. I read fast. That's an unusual skill, I said. I've had time to develop unusual skills. I walked toward the viewport, stood beside him at a respectful distance, far enough not to intrude, close enough to make conversation natural. We looked out at the ships for a moment. He said, what do you know about me? What I heard yesterday, I said, and what I've thought about since. What did you think about? I said, I thought about the word unfinished, and about what it means to wait for something you don't have a name for. He was quiet. Then and I thought that might be the most human thing I've ever heard anyone describe. And that it doesn't have anything to do with the light through your hand or the archival file. It's just a person waiting for the story to make sense. He looked at me then, turned from the viewport. He was backlit by the external lights, the amber and blue-white of the docking arm illumination. And in that light, and at that angle, you could see the quality I'd noticed the previous morning before everything began. The slight luminous inconsistency around the edges of him. The mostly. And in that light with that quality, he looked exactly like what he was. Not a ghost, not a supernatural entity, not a mystery in the conventional sense. A man who had been in a place where existence becomes a probability, and had come out the other side without quite completing the translation, and had been walking ever since in the space between the in and the out. He said, you're good at your work. Information brokerage, I said. Yes. Then here's information, he said. For free, because you were paying attention and most people weren't, and that matters. He turned back to the viewport. I've been in 38 star systems. Not sequentially, the distortion scrambled the sequence pretty significantly. I don't navigate the same way anymore. I go where the next thing is. Where there's something to see or someone to talk to, or a situation that needs a particular kind of involvement that I can provide. Like yesterday, I said, with the freight captain. Like yesterday. And you just knew to be there. I've been watching this corridor long enough to know the alarm types, he said. Security pulse at 5-second intervals means containment breach, origin lower deck. Primary escape route from the lower deck is the commerce floor access ramp. It was geometry. Most people wouldn't have done anything even with that knowledge. Most people would have gotten out of the way, he said. Yes, I used to get out of the way too. But at some point, I don't know exactly when, I stopped being concerned about what happens when someone runs into me. He said it without bitterness, without performance, as simple fact. Doesn't it bother you? I asked. The not knowing how solid you are, the not being sure what happens if someone runs through me? he said. Yes and no. The honest answer is that my relationship to my own physical continuity has changed significantly over 2 centuries. I'm not careless about it, but I'm less invested in it than I was. What I'm more invested in is whether I did something useful, whether something happened that needed to happen. He paused. Yesterday something needed to stop, and I stopped it. And the 3 Vorath civilians in the cargo container are going to be processed and given provisional humanitarian status by the NCA, which is the correct outcome. And the freight captain will face appropriate charges. And the station security officer who got shoved, he'll be fine. He's young enough to shake it off and learn from it. And Marshal Kress, I said. And Marshal Kress, he agreed, will write an anomalous encounter report that will go into the files and probably be read by someone in 50 years who will think it's very interesting. You say that like you expect to see how that turns out. He looked at me with those ordinary human eyes that weren't ordinary at all. I've been around long enough that 50 years from now is the same category as next week, he said. The timescale changes, but yes, I'll probably see how it turns out. He left the station that morning. I know this because I checked the departure manifest, professional habit, and found a notation under provisional status transit clearance. 1 human male, pre-network archival verification, departure via inner corridor transit on a vessel listed as personal navigation craft, designation Havernath's Wake. He'd named his ship after the one that was lost. I don't know if I can tell you exactly what that means, but I've been thinking about it for the 11 months since this happened. And here's where I've landed. When something is taken from you, comprehensively, entirely, in a way that leaves nothing behind, and you survive it, there are 2 things you can do with what comes after. You can put distance between yourself and the loss. Build something new that doesn't look like the old thing, doesn't remind you, or you can carry the name. He'd been carrying the name for 223 years. Not because he was unable to move on. He'd moved. He was still moving. He was, in the most fundamental sense, an organism in motion, a navigator doing the only thing a navigator can do, which is find the next position. But he was carrying the name. Havernath's Wake. The wake is what's left behind by something moving through water, the temporary signature of passage, the place where something was, marked briefly in the medium it moved through, before the medium smooths itself back and the mark is gone. He'd named his ship for an after effect, for the temporary signature, for the evidence that something had been there. Part 6, what this means, if anything. I've thought a lot about whether there's a lesson in this. In the data broker trade, there are no lessons. There's only information, and information either has value or it doesn't, and you move on. But I'm not always just a data broker. Sometimes I'm a person who witnessed something, and witnessing is different from brokering. Brokering is about what you can sell. Witnessing is about what stays with you whether you sell it or not. This stayed with me. Here's what I take from it, not as wisdom, because I'm not a philosophical being by nature, but as observation, which is what I'm best at. The first observation is about Marshal Kress. She drew a knife at someone who turned out to be a 200-year-old human navigator in a state of semi-material existence. That is, by any standard, a situation that fell outside her training and her experience. And what she did, after the initial instinctive response of drawing the weapon, was put the weapon away and ask a real question. What are you? Not in fear, not in anger, not as a threat, as genuine inquiry. I've been thinking about that, about how hard that is actually to do. Most beings, most people in the broad sense, when reality fails to match the model, have a strong impulse to insist on the model rather than update it. The weapon is the model. The model says, unknown, irregular, potentially dangerous. The weapon goes out, and the model wants to stay confirmed. She put the weapon away. And she didn't do it because he was harmless. She didn't know he was harmless at that point. She did it because she recognized that she'd hit a boundary of her model, and the model needed revision, and revision requires putting down the weapon and asking the real question. That's hard. I don't do it often enough. Most people don't. The second observation is about him. He's been in an impossible situation for 2 centuries. By any reasonable accounting of what a person can tolerate, what he's carrying should have produced bitterness, or withdrawal, or the particular angry quietness of someone who's been failed by the universe and decided to hold it against the universe. He hasn't. He's carrying a name. He's watching a corridor. He's noticing what needs to be noticed and being in front of it when it does. And he's still, this is the part that gets me, he's still interested. He looked at Cress's knife with interest, not as a threat, not as an object to be wary of, as a point of connection to a world that's been changing around him for 2 centuries and that he's still curious about. The technical term for what keeps a person going through extreme adversity is resilience. But I don't think that's quite the word for what he has. Resilience implies bouncing back to the original shape. He's not his original shape. Whatever he came out of that distortion as, that's the shape he has now. What he has isn't a return, it's something more like continued investment. He's still interested in what happens next. For 223 years. The third observation is the smallest, but maybe the most important. He named his ship after the wake. Not the vessel, not the crew, not the journey, the wake. The evidence that something was. If you're mostly not solid, if there's always a gap between you and full material existence, then the question of whether you were really there is one that your own experience doesn't fully answer. You were there and also not there. You exist and also are probabilistically incomplete. The name is the anchor. It says something moved through here. The medium showed it briefly and then smoothed, but it happened. He happened, the Havernath's path happened. The crew, the mission, the loss, all of it happened. The name carries it. And he carries the name. Which means somewhere in the space between being and not being, between the in and the out, between the moment he went into the distortion and the moment the universe eventually finishes what it started with him, he's the record. He's the only record. A mostly solid, mostly real, 200-year-old human navigator, moving through the neutral corridors of a galaxy that's changed substantially since he last had a fixed address. Still interested. Still waiting. Still carrying the name. That's the story. I know it doesn't end in a traditional sense. No confrontation resolved, no mystery solved, no clear moral delivered with a bow on it. That's because it didn't end when I stopped watching it. It's still going somewhere. He's still out there in the neutral corridor on a ship called Havernath's Wake, doing whatever comes next. And Marshal Cress is still on Vorath 9, probably, or on the next posting after Vorath 9, with an anomalous encounter report in the files, and a slightly updated model of what transit documentation can look like. And the 3 Vorath civilians from the cargo container were processed by the NCA under provisional humanitarian status. And the last update I had on that situation suggested 2 of them had found work on a mining platform in the outer corridor, and one had gotten passage to a registered Vorath settlement. Not the one she'd been born in, but one. Which is something. And the young Ussan security officer who got shoved, his name is Tarot Ohm. I looked him up. He's still posted to Vorath 9. He told someone in the mess hall 2 weeks after the incident that it was the best day he'd had since taking the posting. Because something happened. Something real. In the dark-walled, air-recycled, amber-lit anonymity of a neutral corridor way station, something real happened. A man who was mostly not there stopped a man who was fully there and fully running from something, and a woman with a knife put the knife away and asked the right question. And the station breathed. Every 43 seconds it breathed. And the record exists because someone was paying attention.